Good morning. The first reading today is from 1 Kings 2, verses 10 to 24. And David lay with his mothers and fathers and was buried in the city of David. The days that David reigned over Israel came to 40 days. In Hebron he reigned 7 years, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years. Thus Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was extremely well-founded. Then Adonijah, son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. She asked, Is it in peace that you come? And he said, Peace. Then he said, I have something to say to you. And she said, Speak. So he said, You know that the realm was mine, and all Israel set... Wait a minute. You know that the realm was mine, and all Israel set their expectations on me to reign. However, the monarchy has turned and become my brother's, for it was from his ruler of all. And now I am asking one thing of you, do not turn me away. And she had said to him, Speak. And he said, Please speak to King Solomon. He will not turn you away, and that he might give me Abishag the Shunammite as my wife. Then Bathsheba said, Good, I myself will speak to the king for you. So Bathsheba went to the king Solomon to speak to him about Adoniah. The king rose to meet her and bowed down to her. Then he sat on his throne and had a throne brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right. Then she said, One small request I ask of you, do not turn me away. And the king said to her, Ask my mother, for I will not turn you away. Then she said, Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to your brother Adoniah for a wife. Then King Solomon replied and said to his mother, Now why would you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adoniah? Ask for him the monarchy, for he is my elder brother, and the priest Abiathar and Joab, son of Zerah, are for him. Then King Solomon swore by the Holy One of old, Thus may God do to me and more, for against his life has Adonai spoken his word. Now, therefore, as the ageless one lives, who has prepared me and placed me on the throne of my father David, and who has made me a house as God promised, today Adonai shall be put to death. The second reading is from Psalm 127. Unless the architect of heaven constructs the castle, those who construct it labor in vain. Unless the all-seeing God guards the city, the guard watches in vain. It is in vain that you all rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of painful birthing labor. For God gives sleep to her beloved. Look, children are a heritage from the author of life, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, thus are the children of one's youth. Happy is the person whose quiver is full of them. They shall not be put to shame when they speak with enemies in the gate. And the last reading today is Luke 22, verses 24 to 30. There was also an argument among the disciples as to which one of them should be considered the greatest. But Jesus said to them, The royals of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have power over them are called benefactors. But not so with you all. Rather, the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? Yet I'm among you all as one who serves. You are the ones who have remained with me in my trials. So then I covenant with you all, just as my Abba has covenanted with me a royal inheritance. so that you may all eat and drink at my table in my realm, and you all will sit on thrones governing the 12 tribes of Israel. May God bless these words to our understanding.
I think that whatever else these passages might speak to, I think these three passages we heard today might help us sort out what is the most important principles of leadership. What are the most important principles of how we live together? Some of them are not so helpful. Some of them call us to a new way of living. Let's start with Solomon. This is just at that time of David's death. And the reign of David has not always been pleasant, has not always been peaceful. He's had one uprising by his son Absalom, which he had to put down rather harshly. Just before his death, Adonijah, who shows up in today's story, got a bit ahead of himself and tried to get himself declared king while his father was still alive. That usually doesn't go well. And behind it all, we have Bathsheba, mother of Solomon, who has very carefully worked it out to ensure that her son will be the rightful heir. So David dies. Now, just before David's death, as he was getting old, getting less active, probably getting cranky, because David was cranky most of his life. To try to cheer him up, his advisors found another concubine, Abishag, who is supposed to have been the most beautiful woman they could find. So David's dead. Solomon's on the throne. Adonijah has sort of accepted the fact that he's not going to be king, even though he was older than Solomon. David had a variety of wives and a variety of children. But as compensation for not getting the throne, Adonijah thinks, well, maybe I can get this beautiful woman for my wife. And so he goes to Bathsheba because he figures, who else is the king going to listen to if not his mummy? And Bathsheba carries the message forward. It doesn't go well. Because Solomon sees in that request, well, A, I think Solomon wanted Abishag for himself. But B, Solomon sees in that request a threat, a claiming for power. And indeed, the first couple of chapters we have in the book of Kings about Solomon's accession to the throne are about Solomon consolidating his power and getting rid of the people who were enemies of his fathers or could be enemies of himself. And Adonijah dies. I was just looking at the next few verses afterwards, and a bunch more people die. Because Solomon's base ethic for governing, in this point in his career, is consolidate my power, get rid of the threats. It's an ethic of jealousy, of fear, and indeed, of vengeance. It's not the part of the Solomon story we normally hear about, because in a couple of chapters, Solomon has a dream, and God says, what do you want? And Solomon says, well, I don't want wealth. I don't want long life. I want to be wise. And God says, you're wise. And here's wealth and long life, too. And most of the stories we have about Solomon proclaim his wisdom, proclaim that he builds the temple, but he begins his reign with murder and jealousy and vengeance and consolidation of power. I think it could be argued he continues his reign that way because he builds the temple with slave labor, and by the end of his reign, the kingdom is on the verge of breaking apart. Jealousy and murder and rage and vengeance and power hunger don't seem to be great ethics for ongoing community. But it is a choice. It's a choice which has been made by thousands of leaders across the world. That the ethic of power is make sure nobody else gets it from you. The psalmist reminds us, unless the architect of heaven constructs the castle, those who construct it labor in vain. The psalmist reminds us that our governing principles, and that's really what our ethics are. Our governing principles, those things, those foundations on which we build all of our actions, need to rest in God. Because unless they rest in God, they're vain. It reminds me of the story from the Gospels of two men who go to build a house. One builds it on solid rock, and one, of course, builds it on sand. And the rains came down and the waters came up. And the house on the sand, what happened? Washed away. And the house on the rock is firm. There was a song about that, wasn't there, Alison? Yeah. Just have to make sure she was paying attention. Unless we ground our basic principles, our basic ethics in God, we're building on sand. Jesus, throughout his ministry, helps us understand what it means to build those foundational ethics, not on what the world considers powerful, What Solomon did when he took the throne in a realm where he had a variety of rival claimants, all of whom had their own sources of power and their own legitimacy to claim the throne, would have made sense in most kingdoms across human history. It would have made perfect sense. If you want to avoid the rebellion, you nip it in the bud before it gets started. Jesus points out there's another way of doing it, another way of being in the world. That those things that everybody else considers sources of power and sources of prestige don't count for much. Jesus calls us to an ethic where we lead by serving, where we don't put ourselves at the top. Jesus gives us an ethic of love, an ethic of service, an ethic of community. He lived in a realm where emperors didn't really think much of community in their ethics. Emperors thought of the emperor. Roman officials thought of the emperor and not the community. You led by leading. You led by enforcement. You led by power. You didn't lead by service. It's one of the reasons why later Paul would talk about the fact that the Christian message is foolishness. Specifically in Corinthians, he mentions it in terms of the crucifixion, which made no sense to Jews or Gentiles in the world. A crucified God just made no sense. But there's much about Christ's ethics that are foolishness in the eyes of much of the world. Service over leadership. Be like a child. Which, by the way, is different from being childish. Some of us are really good at being childish. Jesus calls us to be childlike. Open, ready to learn. Which, yes, I know is a bit of an optimal view of being childlike. But Jesus calls us to an ethic of learning, of growing, of serving each other, of loving each other. And that's the foundation on which community is built. It may not be the foundation on which empires are built. It may not be the foundation on which we can build up great sums of money and build more barns to store more produce. But Jesus had words about that goal as well. Jesus calls us to an ethic of service and love and not putting ourselves first. I've often wondered, and I know a lot of people, including people with political power, imperial power over the years, have professed to follow the ethics they find in the Gospels. Sometimes it's an interesting definition of those ethics that they follow. But I wonder what it would look like if we all lived with our base foundation of serving each other, with our base foundation of not arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, with our base foundation of putting the other person first. What if our leaders did that? How might it change our base attitudes towards wealth, towards what makes somebody important, what makes somebody powerful? How might it change us to continually embrace service, to be reminded that I am among you as one, who serves. Jesus goes on in that passage to suggest that if we follow those ethics, if we follow the ethics of service and love and not putting ourselves first, so then I covenant with you all, just as my Abba has covenanted with me, a royal inheritance, so that you all may eat and drink at my table in my realm. When we follow the ethics, which really are not just the ethics of Jesus, they're the ethics we find in the Old Testament. They're the ethics we find in Jewish law and in Jewish hope for the world, of serving each other, of loving each other. Then we enter the kingdom. Jesus said the kingdom is here among us, if we just have eyes to see it. When we follow the ethics of service and love, we enter the kingdom of God, and we sit at God's table with all those who join us, all those who seek to follow the way, all those who pledge to serve and love their neighbor. May God invite us to the banquet of hope, of love, of service. Amen.